I was born on October 5th, 1920, in Germany. The little place that I was born in was in Demmelsdorf, which is a very little village of, at our time, when I was born, it probably was 32 houses. Today it might be 40, 50 houses, and it's located in southern Germany, approximately 15 kilometers north of Bamberg. The peculiar thing what happened in Germany in those days was that Jews were not allowed in the larger cities, and consequently all families, all Jewish people settled in these small little villages surrounding the larger cities, especially in southern Germany. My father's name was Felix, and he was one of 9 children. My mother's name was Sarah. She also came from a very large family. My father was born in Demmelsdorf. As a matter of fact, the house that he was born in was built by my grandfather at the time when he got married, and the house number is 23. If anybody ever wants to go over there and look at it, it still is standing today. And my mother was born in Sulzburg, which is also, I would say, 30 kilometers from Nuremberg. Between Demmelsdorf and Nuremberg is a distance of about 70 kilometers. She was engaged before she had met my father, and she was very, very unhappy with the fixing up that was done for her, which was a custom in those days. And she told us when we were younger, and I remember it, that she cried and cried and cried. Finally, her father said to her, "Sarah, if you are that unhappy, give the ring back," which she did. And my father had a brother in Nuremberg who was in partnership in a shoe factory with a cousin. And his wife came from Sulzburg, the same place where my mother came from. And the partner told my uncle that there was a young lady available, and and my uncle told my father, and they met. And in those days, I think the way they told us, they met a couple of times, and she evidently thought that he was the right one, and they got married. There were, a sister-in-law was living there, and a sister of my father was living there, and my father always kept telling my mother how she should make things, and if she has any questions, she should ask the sister, and she should ask the sister-in-law, which made her very unhappy. So she always told us the first year it wasn't a marriage that was made in heaven. But then she got used to it, and she really was deeply in love with my father. And I can't, as we grew up, I can't remember, as far as they might have had disagreements, and once in a while I heard my father scream, but as far as closeness between the two of them, it was unbelievable. And she really was proud of my father, and that in return reflected on us children. And one thing in particular I remember, when it used to come to the high holidays, and we went to synagogue, In those days, men and women were separated, and my mother just happened that her seat was upstairs in a synagogue in the front row. And when we used to eat our dinner on the holidays, which was at lunchtime, I remember yet the day where she said, you know, children, who the nicest looking man in the whole synagogue was today when I looked down? Your father. So this kind of good feeling in her reflected as children to us. And especially when you're a child, you don't see any wrong in your father or mother in the first place. So we couldn't see in our father any wrong. Today, probably, or if he would have lived longer, I could have found all kinds of things that maybe were not so great. And it just happened in 1920 when I was on my birthday. It happened to be a very joyous Jewish holiday, which is Simchas Torah. I was born, according to my birth certificate, 7:30 in the morning. And again, those are things that that were told to me. My father had quite a few brothers and sisters, and none of them had any sons, especially his two brothers, or three brothers that he had. So I have two older sisters, so I was the only hope for the name to perpetuate itself. And my grandfather at that time was 81 years old, and when I was born, he must have guarded the house that nobody could go upstairs in the room where my mother and where I was, that God forbid nothing would happen. So the heir to the name would make it. And my grandmother, or my from the father's side, she had passed away already in 1901. When I was born, it was in Tempelhof number 4. That was a house that my father and mother took over from a sister and brother-in-law when I moved into the house that we later on moved. It seems that they followed each other. In those days, there was no running water yet. They had to, I remember that yet. They had to go outside and pump the water in the fountains that were in the middle of the village, and had to carry it home. There was no electric light when we were living in that first house, and we lived there until I was about 6 years old. And in this little village that we lived in was a school, grammar school. And as far as that grammar school was concerned, the teacher had to teach all children that went to school at one time. Now, that went from class 1, when the kids were 6 years old, until they finished, until they were 12, 13, or 14. Each bench had a class, so the education was not the greatest. This is the schoolhouse in Demmelsdorf. Even though the picture has been taken relatively recently, it still looks the same way as when we went to school. And the little house in the foreground is the Hebrew school, where we had our weekly or daily lessons. Especially among the Jewish people, there were a few isolated Gentiles where it also happened. They always were interested that kids get a better education, so they all were sent away at age 10 to go for a better school. Now, most of them went to Bamberg, which was 15 kilometers away. In my case, I went to school in Demelsdorf from the time that I was 6 years old until I was 10 years old. In addition to myself, I mentioned I had two older sisters. One, Fanny, I think she was born in 1915. She's the oldest. My parents got married in 1913. And the second sister, she came 13 months later. Her name is Trude. By the time that I went to school, since they were five and a half, the oldest one was 5.5 years older, the two of them went to school away together, so I was living practically alone with my parents. So I really remember very little as far as my two sisters are concerned. They came home once every 2 weeks, and I was home and I went to school. And when I was 10 years old and I had to go away, they still were away. So there was very little contact. And even when they did come home, or they had vacations in the summer or in the winter, at that stage of life, when you're 5.5 years apart, they didn't want to bother. We were, so to speak, a different generation. I must have been a pretty sickly kid when I was in my real early years. And my mother was always worried that I didn't eat enough. So she tried to stuff the food into me and eat. And little did she know, now the doctors tell me don't eat. What irony, what can happen in life. And but I was interested. My father was a cattle dealer, and even as a youngster, from the early days that I can remember, I was interested in what he did. As far as my grandfather is concerned, I remember he used to get some good cookies from his one son that was away in Nuremberg, who had the shoe factory in Nuremberg. And I remember every time that I went to the house where he lived in, which he was, after his wife had died, he still lived. My grandmother died, he still lived in the house. And he lived with my uncle and aunt. His name was Carl and her name was Babette. And every time I came up there, at least once a day, he gave me a cookie. Now, I don't know whether I came up there to visit him. I have the sneaking suspicion I went up there to get the cookie, okay? But I remember him very vividly. And then when I was 6 years old, we moved into Demelsdorf number 25A. This is the front view, which also shows the barn, but quite a few changes have been made from the time that we lived there. This is an alleyway. It just was across the street from our house, and it led up in between houses to the synagogue. And the little boy that you see sliding down on the snow and ice just as soon could have been me or any one of the other kids of my time, because we used to do the same thing. This is a very sad picture. The barn that you see there in the open space, that is exactly the spot where our synagogue used to stand. And the house in the forefront to the right, family Berg used to live in there. They got killed, never made it, and just a lot of memories. This was a room that was off limits. It used to be called das gute Zimmer. We weren't allowed to go in there in order to keep it clean and not make it dirty. You should see it now, however. But this particular lamp fixture is still the same fixture that my mother and father had bought when they renovated the house. It still is hanging there now. What's so important about this table? It used to belong to my parents. When my mother had to leave and give up her home, the Schmidt family bought it from us, and is still standing there now after all of these years in their home. Benno Schmidt, the son of the old Burgermeister, his father was the Burgermeister during my time, and he was very friendly toward the Jews. As a matter of fact, he was a good friend of my father's and a classmate of his. Unfortunately, during the Nazi time, he had to give up his office. My aunt had passed away, my father's sister, and my uncle moved with a sister to Bamberg. She was a widow, and my father didn't even want to go ahead and stay in Demmelsdorf, because what he didn't like is that we kids had to go away from home. As much as it bothered us, and it bothered every kid that had to go away from home. We were very homesick. I mean, as a youngster, to go away from father and mother, it was always a drama each time it happened. So he went ahead and bought a piece of land in Scheslitz, which is 2 kilometers away, right next to the railroad station. And he had hoped that we would be able to commute between Scheslitz and Bamberg to go to school. I mentioned to you that my father had a brother who lived in a house that my father was born in, and the 2 brothers were in business together. And again, the story has been told that my father must have been also, as a youngster, maybe full of mischief and didn't behave and didn't show that he is going to be the most successful. And my grandfather always told him, you better go ahead and stick to your older brother because you will need him. Well, the way it turned out, it just was the opposite. My father was a very, very astute, good businessman. My uncle, or his brother, he must have glaucoma or whatever it was, and his eyesight went bad. And if anybody took care of a brother, it was my father. Just completely opposite of what my grandfather had predicted. And the younger brother that was in Nuremberg, who more or less was always looking out for the family, had asked my father he should not move away from Demmelsdorf. He should stay with his older brother. And he acquiesced, and he had the house fixed up very nicely, and we moved into the number 25A. In 1926, I said before, there was no electric light, there was no running water, and my grandfather at night always wanted to go ahead and visit my father to see how the business was during the day. My father had been a cattle dealer, and one time it happened that he was an old man, he fell. And when his son, again I have to come back to this uncle, who he was the one who really was quite successful, heard this. He went ahead together with another gentleman who came from Munich and came from, was born in a little village, now living in Cincinnati, by the name of Karl Heiman. The 2 of them together put electric lighting through the village, and also gave the village the money to go ahead and put running water. So you see a little bit of contribution what the people made. we lived a very carefree, happy childhood in that little village. We really enjoyed it. And it was it was a close family life. Everybody knew each other. We ran from one house to the other. You didn't have to ask any questions. And the big city kids, when they had vacations in the summertime during the longer period, they came to Temmelstoff. This brings back a lot of memories. It is Zeckendorf, and every nice summer Saturday evening was spent here by the Jewish families in Temmelstoff, Zeckendorf, and Scheslitz to eat their supper, which was brought by everyone. Naturally, everything was kosher, but the beer and the soft drinks were furnished by the brewery. For sentimental reasons, I asked Sandy and Donnie to sit there because this is exactly the area where the tables and chairs used to stand, where all of the Jewish families used to picnic. And it was pleasant memories. Now, as far as the Gentile population was concerned, as a whole, it was a very, very wonderful relationship. At least I can remember it until I was about 8, 9 years old. 1928, 29, there were no problems. Later on, it got to be a different story. Another thing which is worthwhile mentioning is that among all of the Jewish people that used to live there, every one of them had the same profession. All of them were cattle dealers. And in addition to the cattle dealing, all of them had agriculture. And openly there was no jealousy. And they respected each other's territory. And while they were competitors in cattle dealing, each one of them had his particular farmer that he dealt with. And they got along very wonderful. And I remember the Jewish holidays, and I remember the Saturday, the Shabbat. Friday afternoon, everything was closed down, and the Saturday was kept, and the holidays were kept, and it were kosher homes, and we had a while we went to regular school there, and in Germany it is different than it is here. There is no separation from schooling and religion. The area was Catholic. The kids had Catholic schooling, while in the afternoon we had our Hebrew school lessons. Every one of the Jewish people had their own home, and they had agriculture. Now, there were some of them that had a little bit more, and some of them they had a little bit less, and some of them had a struggle, and some of them didn't have such a struggle. But it was, they all had to work very, very hard, and what made it especially difficult, from what I remember, is the housewives didn't have the conveniences what you have today. There were no refrigerators, there were no washing machines. I remember my mother got up early in the morning and went to bed late at night, and she was known, while she was a very clean housewife and while she was a tremendous cook, she was slow. And I remember this, told at least, she got up early in the morning and kept the shutters closed so people couldn't see there was light in the house, because she wanted to be finished at least in the evening when the rest of them were finished. So in order to go in and do a day's work, she had to get up much earlier yet. And they baked their own bread once every 4 weeks. But when it came to the end, the last loaf was to be eaten. It was pretty hard bread. But we enjoyed it, and we twice a year they killed cattle, and it was naturally done the kosher way. Fridays, my mother used to make a Berges or a Chali, and it was brought to Scheslitz to Bäckerei Schmittinger for baking. As far as food was concerned, we had no problem. And we grew the vegetables in our own garden, and we harvested our own corn and wheat, whatever was necessary. But the people had to work very, very hard. And I remember many times with my father that, especially in the wintertime, when I went out with a horse and with a sled to go on his day's work, came home in the evening late, frozen, cold, not like today when we have the air-conditioned cars and the heated cars. Well, when I was 10 years old, I had to leave Demmelsdorf to go for better schooling, and as fate would have it, by that time, 1930, while Hitler wasn't in power yet, he had enough followers already in those days that anti-Semitism was felt. And instead of going to Bamberg, I went to Fürth, which is right next to Nuremberg. And in Fürth there was a parochial school, a strictly Jewish school, which was a very good school. And my parents felt that I would be better off to go to a Jewish school in order not to be subjected to anti-Semitism. And in addition to having to go away, schooling was not one of my fortes. I enjoyed better playing than studying, and so I needed some help, or tutoring, and I was a boarder with Louis and Paula Kissinger, who were the parents of Henry and Walter. And little did we know in those days that Henry is going to be Secretary of State in America. I was with him from 1930 until 1935, and here too is a little funny story. In order to go to these Realschule, they used to call it in German, you had to make an entrance exam. And I made my exam it was right after Christmas, because the school year in Germany started around Easter time. And a week later, Mr. Kissinger sent us a postcard that I passed the entrance exam. And Easter time, when I came to Fürth, and I was terribly homesick I was 10 years old the first couple of weeks, and cried to beat the band. The first day I went to school, he said to me, look, when you come home, I want you to study with my wife, and in the evening, I'm going to go and see to it and test you to see if you remember what you learned, because you didn't pass the entrance exam. But I